Ever been driving, out in the country, and suddenly you're stuck behind a whole flock of sheep?
Uh-huh. Yeah.
It's like everything just stops, right? And the shepherd's just there guiding them along like it's the most natural thing in the world, totally oblivious to the line of cars waiting.
I know. It's like this clash of two worlds, right? The modern world and then this ancient way of life just chugging along.
Exactly, pastoralism. And it's so much deeper than most people even realize.
It really is like these communities living often in these really tough environments. They've got this incredible ability to adapt to ecological changes, political shifts, you name it. They've been doing it for centuries.
It's amazing, that resilience. And that's exactly what we're diving into today.
Yeah.
With this chapter, Pastoralists in the Modern World, it really struck me how, we think of history as these big dramatic events, but this is like zooming in on a detail you'd usually miss.
Right.
And realizing it holds this whole hidden story.
It's a whole world.
We're talking Gujar Bakarwals, the Gaddis, the Dangars, the Raikas in India, and going all the way to the Maasai in Africa.
Yeah, names you might not recognize right off the bat.
Right. But their way of life has been shaping landscapes and livelihoods for centuries, really.
It's true, and it's not just about, herding animals. Pastoralism, it's a system, a deep knowledge of how to live in sync with some often very challenging environments.
Yeah, these are the folks who thrive in the mountains, deserts, grasslands, places where your typical farming, it just wouldn't cut it.
Exactly. They're masters of reading the land, knowing when to move their herds, where to find the best grazing. It's really in tune with the seasons.
Almost like a sixth sense, right?
Yeah.
About the environment. A connection I think many of us have kind of lost touch with.
Totally. Like, think about the Gujar Bakarwals in India.
Yeah.
They move between, like, the lush meadows of Kashmir in the summer and then down to the scrub forests of the Siwaliks in the winter.
Wow.
It's incredible, this ancient dance with nature, knowing exactly where the resources will be. And that knowledge, it's passed down over generations. Just as valuable as any scientific tool, I think.
Absolutely. And it's not just about, like, survival either, right? The chapter mentioned the Gaddid shepherds. They'd time their migrations to line up with the harvest seasons of settled farmers.
It's interesting.
Yeah, so their sheep would graze on all the leftover stubble, which naturally fertilizes the fields, and they'd get grain in return.
It's a win-win.
Total win-win. This amazingly interconnected system that's worked for, well, who knows how long.
It really highlights how integrated these groups are, not isolated at all. It's like their movements, their whole existence, it shapes the land, obviously, but also the livelihoods of people far beyond their own communities.
Yeah.
And this is what makes the impact of colonialism so huge. The chapter really gets into what happened in India under British rule.
It's a side of history we just don't hear enough about.
No, we don't.
And it's pretty heavy stuff. I mean, we learn about colonialism, the politics, and economics. But this chapter shows how it impacted the daily lives of these pastoralists. Imagine, for our listener, your family has grazed their herds on this land for generations.
Right.
And suddenly, the government declares it unproductive wasteland. Ripe for the taking.
Yeah, basically what the wasteland rules did.
Exactly. The British could just seize control of huge tracts of land that these pastoralists relied on. It was devastating.
It turned their world upside down. And on top of that, you have the Forest Acts, adding a whole other layer of, complexity.
Oh, right, because now the British were worried about timber for themselves.
Exactly. So they start classifying forests as reserved or protected, which on the surface, it doesn't sound awful, right?
Right.
But what it meant was restricting pastoralists' access to the resources they depended on for, forever.
Wow. The irony being that today we're realizing the benefits of controlled grazing.
It's true. They had it figured out ages ago.
It's like they just disregarded centuries of knowledge about living sustainably with the land, all in the name of progress.
Exactly. And to make it all even worse, there was this deep suspicion of the nomadic lifestyle itself, seen as disorderly, difficult to control, even criminal.
Which is where that awful Criminal Tribes Act comes in.
Yeah.
It's hard to believe in the 19th century, they labeled entire communities as criminals just for their nomadic way of life.
It's a dark part of history, and sadly, the echoes of it are still around today.
Oh, absolutely.
Certain groups facing discrimination just because they're seen as different. The Criminal Tribes Act forced pastoralists into settlements.
Really disrupting their traditional movements, their whole way of life.
Exactly. Cutting them off from everything they needed, and then on top of it all, they slapped them with a grazing tax.
Well, come on. That's just adding insult to injury.
It was like they were being squeezed from every direction. Loss of land, restricted movement, new financial burdens, just for living the way their ancestors always had.
Got brutal.
It shows how colonial policies, they weren't just ideas, they had real and often devastating consequences for people. And it wasn't just limited to India either. Look at the Maasai in Africa, and you see the same pattern of disruption playing out.
So we've been talking about how colonialism really upended the lives of pastoralists in India.
Mm,
But like you said, it wasn't just happening there.
right.
Let's shift gears over to the Maasai in East Africa for a bit. What did this clash between, well, tradition and colonial rule look like for them?
Okay, so picture this, right? You and your people, you've been moving across this land, your land, for centuries, and suddenly, boom, a border you never agreed to just cuts right through it.
Wow.
That's what the Maasai experienced. Late 19th century, British Kenya, German Tanganyika, they drew a line right through Maasai territory.
It's such a stark example of how these global forces play out in such a personal way, right?
Yeah.
You've lived your whole life one way, and overnight the rules change. And that new border, that was just the beginning of the challenges, I'm guessing.
Oh, absolutely. Now they've got this new geopolitical reality to deal with. But on top of that, the British are encouraging local farmers to expand. Remember how we talked about the British seeing grazing land as wasted potential? The same
Yeah.
thinking here. So the Maasai are seeing their grazing lands shrinking as more and more of it is turned into farmland.
It's like this pattern just repeats itself, disregarding the existing ways of life that worked on that land for centuries.
It's a recurring theme, yeah. And it gets worse. The Maasai also had to deal with game reserves being established.
Oh, right, those iconic parks,
Mm.
safaris, conservation efforts, the Masai Mara, Serengeti.
Exactly.
The irony is not lost on me. These lands set aside for preservation were once the Maasai's grazing grounds.
Yeah, it's a classic example of how conservation, while well-intentioned often, can have these unintended consequences for indigenous communities.
Absolutely.
While these parks have become synonymous with conservation, their creation further restricted the Maasai's movements and their access to vital resources.
Mm.
They're being squeezed from all sides, their traditional way of life more and more under threat.
And then, as if things couldn't get any worse, they get hit with those catastrophic droughts in the 1930s.
Devastating. And it really shows how colonial policies amplify the effects of a natural disaster,
Right, because in the past, drought hits. The Maasai would move their herds to where the pasture and water were more plentiful. That's the brilliance of pastoralism, adapting to nature.
Exactly. But now, confined to a limited area, nowhere to go, their cattle are decimated, livelihoods shattered.
It's heartbreaking and a stark reminder of how vulnerable these communities are to forces beyond their control. Shifting borders, changing land use policies, even a changing climate. It all adds up.
It's a crucial point. But amidst all these immense challenges, both in India and Africa, what's remarkable is that these pastoral communities found ways to adapt.
They had to.
They had to, for their very survival.
Let's talk about that resilience for a bit. We've talked about the hardships, but the chapter also highlights some amazing examples of these communities, well, not just surviving, but finding ways to thrive
Oh, yeah.
in the face of these huge challenges.
Absolutely.
Like the Raikas in India, for example. After the partition of India and Pakistan, many Raikas who would traditionally migrate between these regions, they couldn't cross those new borders.
Right.
So they're cut off from the routes they've relied on for generations. What did they do?
They adapted. They shifted their migration routes, found new grazing lands in Haryana. Their sheep could graze on the harvested fields there, provided a valuable service to those settled farmers in the region, and allowed the Raikas to continue their way of life.
It speaks to their resourcefulness, doesn't it? Their ability to read the changing landscape, both literally and figuratively, and find these new ways to thrive. Really quite remarkable. What other examples of adaptation stood out to you?
Well, the Maasai response is fascinating. You see, some wealthier pastoralists, recognizing the way things were changing, they started accumulating resources, buying land, transitioning to more settled lifestyles.
Okay.
At the same time, a lot of poorer pastoralists, without those resources, they were forced into wage labor, working for those who had managed to adapt more successfully.
So almost like an internal shift within the community itself. Colonial pressures forcing a restructuring of their social and economic hierarchies.
Exactly. It wasn't just about adapting herding practices. It was about navigating this whole new set of social and economic realities. And often that meant challenging traditional power structures within these communities as well.
Yeah, this idea of internal adaptation, it's so important. Reminds us that these aren't these monolithic groups frozen in time. They're made up of individuals making incredibly difficult choices in the face of extraordinary change.
Yeah,
And it's a story that continues to unfold even today.
it does. And those choices, those adaptations, they weren't always easy or straightforward, often involved compromise, negotiation, sometimes even conflict.
Hmm.
But the takeaway here is that these communities, they persisted. They retained their identity, their way of life, in a world that was changing rapidly around them. Their resilience, it's a testament to the human spirit, really.
You know, it really strikes me how we've been looking at this whole intricate tapestry of history.
Yeah.
And it's like you only see the full picture when you zoom in on these communities, on these threads that connect us all.
Mm-hmm.
And you realize just how much resilience is woven into them.
It's a powerful way to look at it. But, you know, it's easy to romanticize pastoralism a bit,
I know what you mean.
to view it through these rose-tinted glasses of history, you know? But it's crucial to remember these are real people facing real challenges.
Oh, for sure, even today.
Even today, exactly.
And the chapter doesn't shy away from that either. It acknowledges that pastoralists around the world are struggling,
Right.
having to make these tough choices as the world keeps changing, often in ways that don't value their way of life. But I also felt this sense of hope.
Oh, absolutely.
It's not just a story of hardship.
Not at all.
Right.
See, here's the thing. Even as they adapt, even as they're being pushed to change, they're also pushing back.
Really? How so?
They're demanding recognition of their rights, access to the resources they need,
Makes sense.
and a voice in the decisions that affect their lives, their livelihoods. They're not just passively adapting, they're actively shaping their own futures. They're advocating for sustainable land management practices, they're challenging policies that marginalize them,
Oh,
and they're reminding the world that their knowledge, their way of life, it has a lot to offer, especially now as we face all this environmental uncertainty. I mean, they've been living sustainably for centuries. There are lessons there for all of us.
absolutely. Which brings us to that final thought-provoking question the chapter leaves us with. What can we, in our modern world, learn from this adaptability? What can we take from their story and apply it to our own lives?
It makes you think, doesn't it? In a world obsessed with progress, with growth, often at the expense of, well, everything else, the environment, the people on the margins, the resilience of these pastoralists, it's a powerful counter-narrative.
Yeah.
It's a good reminder that progress doesn't always mean moving forward, you know? Sometimes it means taking a step back, learning from the past, recognizing that traditional knowledge, traditional ways of life, they have a place in shaping a better future.
It's humbling, really, and something I'll be thinking about for a long time. So to our listener, next time you're driving through the countryside and see a shepherd with their flock, or even watching a documentary about the Maasai herding their cattle across the savannah, take a moment. Remember, their story is part of our story too. It's a story of resilience, of adaptation, and just this enduring power of humanity to find a way forward even when the path is uncertain.
Beautifully said. And on that note, we'll leave our listener to consider these stories, the threads that connect us all across time, across cultures, and to find their own meaning in the timeless wisdom of these communities around the world.